You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We're pleased to announce our podcast is a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today, you know his name, that's for sure, Martin Dugard. And how do you know his name? Well, he's the co-author with Bill O'Reilly of the Killing series. But today, we're going to talk about his latest book, which I can tell you is simply terrific. We'll put a link to it so that you can purchase it after you listen to the podcast. It's called Taking Berlin: The Bloody Race to Defeat the Third Reich. Mr. Dugard, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You've written all these books. I had written this like kind of flowery introduction, and then I've decided to chuck it all and just laugh and say, you need to go to his website. And the one thing you'll find about Mr. Dugard is he is not a couch potato. Between electric shock and running the bulls and various other things, he's been around the world. And that came through to me, that came through in your book, that you were able to do in a really succinct and helpful way to put the perspective of the world into why this race to Berlin took place. So first, let me ask, why was there a race to Berlin on behalf of the Western powers in World War II, basically against their Russian allies or Soviet allies? And why was this race important?
Oh, good questions. Well, you would think that with the Soviets being our ally, that we wouldn't have any competition, that we would all just work together to get there. But the Soviets were already sowing the seeds of what would become the great Soviet post-war empire and the Warsaw Pact nations. The Soviets have been invaded so many times and devastated by the many invasions that they wanted to get a series of buffer countries around them. So, Poland and, Bulgaria and, Yugoslavia. But going back to the race to get to Berlin, everybody just wanted to get the war over. After D-Day, everybody was predicting the war would be over by Christmas, and people just wanted to crush Hitler as soon as possible. But it didn't work out that way, especially after the fall of Paris. Things kind of fell apart as far as the pace of the adventure. And Patton and Montgomery got hung up on the Western Front, right on the German border. The Soviets were pushing into Germany after Operation Bagration, which was their version of D-Day, which was this massive invasion. But the Germans weren't defeated, as we saw at the Battle of the Bulge. So that I like to say that the last 9 months of the war laid the foundation for the post-war world and even the world as we know it now. But it was supposed to be a cakewalk, and instead it turned out to be some of the most vicious fighting of the world of the war.
We have several interesting personality studies, character studies as part of your book, and I'd like to go through those quickly if we could, and then start our own race to Berlin. If you look at the cover of your book, the most prominent face is 4-star General George S. Patton. Most of us maybe we've read about him, but clearly a lot of our opinions about Patton are formed from the movie. What did you think about when you were doing the research? Like, this guy is actually the way George C. Scott portrayed him. And why was it important for Patton, in your view, not to make you an amateur psychologist, but to get so much glory?
Oh, well, first of all, historically, the movie Patton holds up really, really well. I mean, it's when you go back through, after having written about Patton in, I think, 3 or 4 different books, that movie really holds up well. What most people don't know is that Patton didn't have that George C. Scott gravelly, low voice. He actually had a very high-pitched voice, and not girly, but in a higher register. And so, for him to command respect despite that high tone shows that he had a gravitas towards him. I don't think Patton was really as much of a glory hog as people think, but I do know that he had trained his entire adult life as a warrior. West Point graduate, stayed in the Army after World War I at a time when his career was going absolutely nowhere. And he realized that World War II, and in particular, the advance from the Normandy beaches where he wasn't in the D-Day invasions, but from the Normandy beaches all the way to Berlin, he knew that this was his last shot. He was never going to see a war on this scale ever again. He was a big fan of armor. He was part of the armor contingent that gathered secretly in May 1940 to kind of shove the cavalry out of the U.S. Army and let the tank people take over. And he was also a big proponent of close air cover. So he was doing things that people weren't really doing at that time, but he also knew that there wasn't going to be another chance, so he'd better make the most of it. And that's why, and I think Montgomery was the same way, but that's why the two of them were so competitive with one another, because both were great generals in their own right, two completely different styles. But they knew that when World War II was over, they weren't going to, like Patton wasn't going to go to the Pacific. There was no way that Douglas MacArthur was going to let Patton go to the Pacific. And
which is in the movie. Scott says that there's no way he'll let me over there.
Yeah, no, there's and I think MacArthur is a vastly inferior general. So just my opinion, but
that's all right.
But I think I'm very drawn to Patton. He's easy to write about because he's got these, his moods go from, very patriotic and very courageous all the way down to very low and very almost depressed. He just had these moments, if you read his journal, where he had grave doubts. He had bouts of great anger towards some of the powers that be, particularly Eisenhower, that were trying to slow him down. So he's a very complex character, and from an author's point of view, that's pure gold. He's great to write about.
You mentioned Eisenhower very quickly. Patton and Eisenhower were friends before the war, close friends. Patton, I believe, was his superior, and it's pretty clear. It's more than clear, it's fact. Their personal relationship deteriorated significantly at the close of the war until Patton's untimely death, which you can read about if you read Killing Patton by Martin Dugard and Bill O'Reilly. What happened to the Eisenhower-Patton relationship?
Well, you have to remember about Eisenhower is that he never commanded men in battle. He was very much a logistical genius. He'd always been a staff officer, especially in the years before the war, and he just had a gift for organization and diplomacy. The British, this caused the British to not think much of him as a wartime leader. Patton knew better than to say that, to Eisenhower's face, but he felt the same way. And Eisenhower's job became, to rein Patton in, and Patton didn't take kindly to that. So they had it was a very complex relationship by the time we get to 1944, 1945. Eisenhower had pardoned Patton for slapping soldiers and speaking out of line in May 1944 about the Soviet presence in the post-war world. But Eisenhower had a very different job to do than Patton, and they were approaching the war from two different angles. And Patton could not have done what Eisenhower did as far as being a diplomat and commanding the entire expeditionary force in Europe. But at the same time, Eisenhower could never have done what Patton did. And, Patton's genius as a general compares with Eisenhower's genius as a general, but they just had two different skill sets.
It's hard to describe, and you spend a lot of time on this figure. I'm going to describe him as a tragic figure, and I've read a little bit about him before, but you take it into new depths, really, in some sentences and some language I'd never read, and that's Nazi German or German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. He's kind of made famous somewhat also by the movie Patton, because Patton thinks he's such a genius. "You magnificent bastard, I read your book." I think it's the quote.
Yep.
And Rommel was very well respected by everybody. But you take the time in your book to talk a little bit about his conversion, the fact that he never joined the Nazi Party, but him realizing that the war is just simply over, and his implicit participation in the July 20, 1944 assassination plot. Why did you want to make Rommel such an important part of your book?
Well, I'm a big fan of the narrative thread, and when I did the prequel to Taking Berlin was Taking Paris, which talks about May 1940. It opens with May 1940, and the first chapter is Rommel as the Germans are attacking through the Ardennes forest, and he's leading men on the bank of the Meuse River, and the Germans are punching through, and later on their way to capture all of France. And I was taken with his skills as a leader and his relentlessness, and then especially as you go on into the desert in his battles with Montgomery at El Alamein. He's just, I don't think there's such a thing, I don't want to use the term a good Nazi, but he was more of a military figure than a political figure. And I wanted to show the German side to it. But then, again, it's always a writer's, dream whenever you see people who've left behind extensive diaries and journals, and people have a good opinion of them. And then, because when you look at what Rommel had a lot of hope for the German cause. He came back from North Africa. He was kind of banished. There was a lot of jealousy in the German officer ranks for the great things Rommel had done, and they kind of wanted to put him in his place. Hitler had lost his faith in Rommel, but Rommel was trying to get it back. His last-ditch effort to really salvage his career was to build the Atlantic Wall, which is supposed to keep the Allies out of Normandy, and he did a fantastic job. A lot of those obstacles were and the new fortifications built were, at the behest of Rommel. But, once the Allies gained a toehold in France, and in particular, when his car was shot up by Canadian Royal Air Force Spitfire, and he was sent to the hospital, he had a lot of time to think. He had a lot of time to think about the shape of the war and the future of Germany. And as someone who was more of a patriot to Germany than a patriot to Adolf Hitler, he was privately hoping that Hitler would find a way to sue for peace and maybe serve a jail term of some kind, and put not let Germany get destroyed or partitioned by the Soviets. So I liked including Rommel in this book. And what was nice was that, when he was sent home after he was injured, was the time he spent with his son Manfred, and the fact that by talking to his son, he could voice a lot of the doubts and fears that he had that you would not normally hear a general say, because if he said it to another individual, it might get back to the powers that be, that, and he could be convicted of treason. Instead, he was able to have long philosophical discussions with his sons about warfare and the shape of warfare and the shape of post-war Germany. And there's a real poignance to it, particularly when Manfred is there, when Rommel is eventually taken away and forced to commit suicide by Hitler.
Another figure in the book who I'd heard of but did not know a lot about, you detail one of the really strong points of the book, and we're talking with a best-selling author Martin Dugard about his book Taking Berlin: The Bloody Race to Defeat the Third Reich. And I'm going to ask you a little bit about some of these later, but you have several, and I'm going to call them vignettes for lack of a better term, about personal bravery and leadership as the Allies are traversing eastward from Normandy. And one of the ones that struck me is your narrative look at General James Gavin, who commanded airborne troops. 82nd Airborne, was that right? Did I remember that right?
82nd, yeah.
And, I was in the Army for 3 years. Thank God I never dropped out of a plane or never volunteered to do so. But you read about some of these stories and you just wonder how these people ever slept at night. But you mentioned Gavin quite a bit. Why did you decide to make him so prominent in your book?
Well, the thing about this last year of the war is that you have all these huge battles. Let's just take on the Western Front, forget the Soviet stuff. But you've got D-Day, you've got Market Garden, you've got the Battle of the Bulge. These are all a book into themselves, and I could have spent page after page talking about, troop placements and where we attacked and where we counterattacked, and that's all well and good. And there are people that write books like that very, very well. But I find that I like to write books that are very fast moving, that are very immediate, that put the reader there with in the action, so you feel like you're part of it. And the best way to do that is to focus on the individual instead of the overwhelming, numbers of people that are on a battlefield. So in the case of Gavin, he's a great guy to write about because he dropped onto Sicily, he jumped into Normandy, he was the first out the door all the time. He jumped in Market Garden, he led men in a famous crossing of the Wall River that we saw in the movie A Bridge Too Far. And on top of that, he was 37 years old. He was a 2-star general at 37. He was a kid who'd grown up as an orphan and, raised by adopted parents, got himself through West Point and rose through the ranks and was a superior leader of men. And it was just great to weave him into the story. So, with Patton, you have armor. With Gavin, you have the emerging airborne unit, which was not a thing before World War II. We'll probably talk about Martha Gellhorn in a bit. I like having a journalist in there, but I'll tell you about that in a bit. But it's just nice to have these different facets of individuals see the war through their story. And it kind of helps propel the action along, because if you have a guy like Gavin who jumps on D-Day, and then, that's June 1944, then you have Market Garden, which is September 1944. He's at the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944. Is about to be in Operation Victory that would have been the drop on Berlin that never happened. So you have this narrative thread. I can just poke him into the narrative as in the real-time action that paralleled what happened in the war. So worked out very well in that respect.
I confess I had never heard of Martha Gellhorn. I had heard of her husband, who is Ernest Hemingway at this time during World War II. You mentioned wanting to have a journalist in there. There are lots of men, quite frankly, you could have chosen. She certainly comes off as having as much moxie as anyone else you describe, except maybe the people who are rowing past rivers and charging machine gun nests. Why did you choose her? Tell us a little bit about her, A, and B, why did you choose her?
To tell you the truth, I wanted to put Hemingway in there. So it would have been great because we would have had, the cover of the book would have been, Gavin and Patton and Churchill and Hemingway. I mean, these, other than Gavin, three of the four of those are very iconic individuals. But to tell you the truth, Hemingway was kind of a shit during the war. He got a lot of fame for liberating Paris, which he did, but he really wasn't the character I was looking for. I didn't find him consistent. He wasn't in the war long enough. For instance, Martha Gellhorn, his third wife, who was a great journalist in her own right, she wanted to get to D-Day so badly, then they weren't allowing women to go on land, that she stowed away on a hospital ship and helped tend to the wounded and actually went ashore at night to look for the wounded bodies to take them back to the hospital ship. Whereas Hemingway watched the landings on a naval vessel, miles offshore. Two different ways to get to the story. And, afterwards Hemingway went back to his hotel, whereas Gellhorn continued traveling around the European theater. And just like I said with Gavin, where Gavin was in all these different operations, well, Gellhorn pops up at all these things too. She's at D-Day, she's at Market Garden, she's at the Battle of the Bulge, she's in all these places. And and then as I began to read her writing and I got to know her as a character, I developed a profound respect for her courage. And some people have read the book and they're saying, why would you put a woman in a war zone? It's because she was in the war zone.
She was in the war zone. Yeah, I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
She wasn't on the periphery. She was in there. Absolutely right.
When I was doing the research, I found her house. She had a flat in London, in the Chelsea area, and it was raining. But I found her place just to say that I'd been there. But it was pouring rain, so my wife and I took refuge on her porch, which was covered. And the person who lives there now came home and found us sitting on their porch, and we just explained we're there to sit out in the rain. But I got this connection with Gellhorn. I mean, I realized that by sitting on her porch, I was sitting in a place where she had walked through day after day, and she'd used the same handrail and pushed open the same door. It was kind of cool, just to kind of get that connection with the character.
Not to be a complete spoiler, but she and General Gavin commence a love affair. Did you know that fact before you started to weave her into the book, or did you just all of a sudden go, oh?
Yeah, no, it was that. And I'll tell you what, that's one of those great, it's one of those days where you're working and you're trying to put together a story, and all of a sudden you realize that they had a connection, and it's a little bit mind-blowing, because all of a sudden it's like, wow, we got a story here. And what happened was, she met him in Nijmegen right after Market Garden, when she was there to file a story. And, she went about her business just like he went about his business throughout the war. He was, transferred to Sissonne in France for his men to regroup and train. She went on to Italy to cover some stuff in Italy. She covered other battles in the war, but she kind of always made her way back and found him. And she wasn't really a camp follower per se. She just was having this fling with the general. It was a very fiery romance. They had some epic fights. But the great mystery to me was the specific dates, like when did they meet, when did they get together. And another thing that just kind of came out of the blue, literally a month before I finished the book, someone reached out from the Gavin estate. They were publishing his wartime journals that had never been published before. He typed them with a little portable field typewriter, and so everything was it wasn't in his handwriting. It was very easy to read. So I actually got a hold of his journals. So I found out just as the book went into production that, for instance, they met on October 15th, 1944. So that's in the book. And then then there's all his comments about her. He calls her Mrs. Hemingway at first, and then you look at his letters to her, and both of them were just crazy about each other. But this is going on in the middle. These are two of the most influential people of the war, and this is going on in the middle of frontline fighting. It's remarkable.
You start your book with Normandy and the planning for the invasion and how it took place. I read a terrific book, I believe it was by Craig Simons, about just the logistic plan, operational plan for D-Day, everything they had to do to actually make it happen. I stopped reading your book, got on my desktop computer, and just watched Saving Private Ryan again. And it helped me get in the mindset of what you were describing. And then I'm glad I did, because some of your descriptions of what the men went through and endured are the best that I've ever read.
Thank you.
Normandy, you said it a few minutes ago, take the Russian front out of it, which is just almost incomprehensible in so many ways. But Normandy, we look back now, well, of course they invaded France. They've been trying to. Of course they overwhelmed the Germans. And to quote the Duke of Wellington, it was a near-run thing. How close did the Normandy invasion come to failing?
Well, I think if Rommel had his way and he'd had more panzer divisions sent to Normandy instead of Calais, and even after the invasion, Hitler was convinced that that was a feint, that the main invasion was going to come at Calais, I think it would have been a much different battle. And I don't think we would have been thrown back into the sea, but I think it would have been one of those engagements where we fought on a very narrow strip of land with horrific losses before finally breaking through. I just think that instead of getting off the beaches and really starting to push inland by August, which 2 months after the invasion, I think it would have been more like a 5 or 6 month fight. Actually, very much like Montgomery went through when he was supposed to capture Cannes, which is a small city right off the Norman coast, and he was stuck there for months. And just because the Germans had a pocket of resistance there. Again, one of those research things. I'd been to the American Cemetery. I'd been to D-Day before, or Normandy before, but as part of the research, I went back there in February of this year. Yeah, which is if you're going to go to Normandy, don't go in the summer because the roads are narrow and it's full of tourists and tour buses. But if you go in February, nobody's there, and you can really take your time and you can go over all of the sites, and they'll show you where all the sectors were, like Dog Red, and where Omaha was, and Juno and Sword and all those. But I've got this moment in the book where General Norman Cotto leads men up off the beach. He has that famous saying, "Rangers lead the way." And during this last trip, I stood at that spot, and you realize how small that crescent of beach is when the tide is out, and you had all this men and material and these explosions. And then, my wife took a picture of me standing on the road, and I realized that road, the place I was standing, that was landmines and barbed wire. And German snipers zeroed in on those specific places from the bluffs overlooking it. Just a very, very slender place to do such an amazing landing and invasion. And it's even to this day you can feel the ghosts. It's powerful.
I would also say, if you're gonna, I was there like 25 years ago, maybe. If you go, take your Kleenex. I don't care how tough. I don't care how tough you think you are. Take your tissues, because you're going to need them. Not to digress, but I posted something on social media a couple of years ago that I haven't watched the Oscars since Saving Private Ryan lost the Best Picture Oscar to the egregious Shakespeare in Love. What do you think of that? You don't have to skip the Oscars on my behalf, but what do you think do you remember watching that movie the first time, and how do you think it holds up for the next, almost 20 years after it was released?
I think the first 20 minutes hold up. I would just watch it again recently. Some of the best, I don't care, not even just wartime movie, just the best movie making that you can imagine. I mean, just the realism of that moment and just the way it was shot. If you watch the rest of the movie, the rest of the movie is pretty much it's a straightforward, cowboy movie. We're going to go in and rescue the hero and get him out. And it's a very entertaining movie, but we watched the movie for the first 20 minutes.
There's actually on YouTube videos of people watching the movie for the first time and reacting to the movie, and it's interesting to see how many people just break down, like, "Oh my God, I had no idea this was coming." I watched the movie with my mother, who was in the Marine Corps, and it was the only movie I've ever been to that at the end nobody left.
Oh yeah.
There wasn't some big rush to get up and throw your popcorn away. People were just kind of sitting there like, "Oh my God, what did I just see?"
You know what? When I first saw the movie, I had a friend who worked for Steven Spielberg's production company. And so he was on the list for the the screening, the industry screenings. And it was the same way. Usually if you go to an industry screening, the agents will work the room until it's time for the movie to start. Then as soon as it's over, everybody starts, kind of, deal making and just, kind of making nice. Two movies. It was Saving Private Ryan and Schindler's List were the exceptions to the rule. Everybody was dead silent. Everybody watched the credits all the way through and just left. Nobody hung out in the lobby. Nobody, you couldn't see people doing deals or, it was totally silent. It was crazy.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. I should mention that the patriarch of McAllister Machinery, Mr. McAllister, whose first name was Pershing, was actually part of the D-Day invasion or the D-Day landings in North Africa in November 1942.
Oh, that's good.
We are here with Martin Dugard, the author of Taking Berlin, The Bloody Race to Defeat the Third Reich. You mentioned your writing. I agree with you. I have a hard time like reading these 600 and 700 page books about one battle, right? Like I just can't keep all the divisions and brigades and battalions straight. It's almost your book in that sense was a relief, even though I'm like, okay, now which army is this? But getting into the granular part of any war involves discussing what happens to the men. How did you decide how much sort of sanguinary passages to include, and why did you choose the ones you chose?
That's a good question. There's a lot to warfare. I've never been in combat. I've just read enough and spoken to enough people. There's a lot. It's a very isolated human experience. I mean, people, even in the middle of like if you're in a foxhole, for instance, you still got to eat. You still have to go to the bathroom. So how much do I want to make out of people, going to the bathroom in their ration kit, or people, having to pee inside a foxhole, stuff like that. And then when people get hurt, when we have the term missing in action. Very often, missing in action means that an artillery shell landed on your position and there's nothing left of you but pink vapor. So you just have to find a balance. Obviously the stuff going on in D-Day was like German snipers talked about how much they enjoyed pulling the trigger. Meanwhile, imagining that every time they pulled the trigger, there was going to be a telegram going home to some family somewhere in America saying that their son was dead and that individual was responsible for it. So, you kind of I want it to be real. I want to be able to point out all those things. And, for instance, there are no bathrooms in a tank. So if you talk to tank commanders, people talk about being able to go to the bathroom right in front of all their buddies and not thinking twice about it. But if you mention that once, people go, "Ooh, that's tough." But if you mention it like 3 or 4 times, people are like, "Okay, we get it." So you've got to find where to insert these things because they're going to have an impact. People will remember those moments, but you don't want to be known as the author who talks about people becoming pink mist. That's just not. There's too much at some point.
Let me say for those of you who haven't read the book but will read the book that Mr. Dugard strikes the balance really well. He throws in just enough sort of, oh God, I guess they would have to go to the bathroom, wouldn't they? Along with descriptions of combat. My son Joshua did 2 tours in Afghanistan as 11 Bravo, 11 Bang Bang combat infantryman. And I said, I asked him one time, how would you describe it? And his response was, I'd rather not.
Oh, yeah.
And so were there any particular acts of bravery? You described so many of them in the book, including several mentions of Medal of Honor recipients. And we've been lucky enough to have a Medal of Honor recipient on the Leaders and Legend podcast, and that's Sammy Davis here from Indiana, who received his in Vietnam. Actually is the inspiration for Forrest Gump. In the movie, when you see Tom Hanks getting the Medal of Honor from President Johnson, it's actually Sammy Davis with Tom Hanks's head on his body. Were there 1 or 2 acts of bravery that you encountered and detailed or chronicled in your book that just left you agape? Like, how in the hell did this guy survive? Or even if he didn't, where did he find the courage to do what he did?
What I was doing, when I was I was trying to find individuals to kind of move the story forward. And I wanted to keep it, with, for instance, Patton's with the Third Army. So I wanted to highlight moments of courage within the Third Army. So I looked up Medal of Honor recipients who were part of Patton's Third Army. And so I had two individuals in particular, and Bud Hawk was one of them, who was a guy who just did this crazy thing during the Battle for the Falaise Pocket, where he basically served as a artillery coordinator for two, tank destroyer companies, shooting at the Germans, but put himself out in the open and continued to fight even after the battle was almost done. It was just crazy brave stuff. And the cool thing about these things is that a lot of these World War II guys who got the Medal of Honor recorded their story on video, and you can find them if you look online. A lot of YouTube stuff. They hear these guys talk about what they did, and they're really just normal guys. They're just people.
They all became UAW members after the war, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
build the post-war American world.
They were the guys. They had a can of Bud, and they had the hat on, and all that kind of stuff. Hey, speaking of, I've got to ask you just off. Now, where in Indiana are you?
Indianapolis.
Oh, okay. My dad was stationed at Bunker Hill Air Force Base, which became Grissom Air Force Base.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we lived there when I was a kid. So my dad used to fly B-58s. It was, but anyway, that's.
Oh, that's, yeah. It's so, you mentioned that about the combat vets, and I was Sammy Davis. He's very matter of fact about what he did, and then you read about what he did, and you're like, how do you sleep? Like, how do you possibly function? But another person I knew and you'll know this story too, sir, is. We grew up with a family on the east side in Irvington here in Indianapolis named the O'Donnells. And the patriarch of the O'Donnells, James O'Donnell, was on the USS Indianapolis.
Oh, no kidding. Wow.
And we were all just petrified of him for lots of reasons. Matter of fact, I tell the story. My brother was his newspaper man and never collected from him because he was too scared to knock on the door.
That's funny.
But a lot of these, to your point about these testimonials, you watch a documentary about the movie Jaws, and they get to the USS Indianapolis scene, and then they have Indianapolis survivors on the documentary saying that they didn't know it was coming, and they're watching the movie, and all of a sudden, in a couple of cases, they talk about how they started to break down, and their grandkids or kids are with them, are like, "What? What's
going on?"
Like the shark's not even in the movie. Like, what are you crying for?
Yeah.
And so these chronicles and other things in pop culture help bring out the stories of these veterans. And it's a terrific part of your book, how you detail how some people just found the courage to do things that you just couldn't possibly do in ordinary life.
Yeah. And it's to me, it's a little bit crazy because a lot of these people had a lot to lose. And, I chronicle the story of a medic who just, basically he was just a medic. All he had to do was just take care of people and carry stretchers, and he would have gone home just fine. But, when the Germans open up on a boat full of wounded in the middle of a river, he swims to the boat, drags the boat to shore, then, helps carry the wounded to safety. I mean, really, where do you get the inspiration to do that? At some point, it just has to, I think you can't think about it. Also in the book, you talk about the Japanese American soldiers who fought, in Europe, and their acts of courage were just insane. Just the way they put themselves out there. And in the battle I describe in the book, I think 5 of those guys won the Medal of Honor. It was I wouldn't say miraculous. It was just spontaneous acts of amazing courage.
And that's the 442nd.
Yeah.
Looking at it from a geopolitical, sort of a larger context, did the United States, did the Western Allies make a mistake by not emphasizing and prioritizing the taking of Berlin? And do you think if Eisenhower, or not Churchill because he was screaming, if Roosevelt and Eisenhower had a chance to do it over again, they would make the same decision?
I don't think they would. It's interesting. I talk a lot of in the back of the book. I mentioned that what Putin is doing in Ukraine. Roosevelt got played by Stalin. Roosevelt was the most political individual you can imagine. And yet, when it came to dealing with Stalin, he believed that this ruthless, barbarian dictator was going to do the right thing. And by not pushing through, we basically, we enslaved Eastern Europe for 40 plus years. And what Putin's doing right now, and in the fact that it's a page straight out of Stalin's playbook, and it as an historian, I watch it and I almost want to throw things at the TV, because can't people see that events are replaying themselves, and we need to take the same authoritarian stance that Truman eventually took. It's just it was we made a big mistake at the end of the war, and Patton wanted to keep going. Patton was convinced that we'd take all the Nazis who we had in all those prison camps and we put them to work, and they go fight the Russians, and that would have been the war.
And that part's in the movie where it says we're going to have to fight him eventually. And he turned out not to be right, but in a sense, in the larger sense, might as well do it here may as well fight them here while we are here. You mentioned, you obliquely referenced the Yalta Conference in February of 44. Or 45, excuse me. It's pretty fair to say that's not Franklin Roosevelt's finest hour. Why do you think that I don't want to say romanticized Uncle Joe, as he called him, Uncle Joe Stalin, but he just never seemed to be the one. And it's clear in any book that you've read about Stalin, any book that you've read about Yalta, that Stalin clearly treated Roosevelt differently than he treated Churchill. A whole different level of respect, for sure. But it just surprised me that Roosevelt didn't go, well, Stalin's probably killed as many of his own citizens as Hitler killed Soviet citizens. So we probably can't take his word for things. But yet he did.
He did. It was, you talk about that balance. Everybody knew, and it was sad, Churchill was working so hard to keep Britain in the mix as one of the relevant nations as a global power. But everybody knew, Roosevelt and Stalin knew it was going to be America and the Soviet Union in the post-war world. We propped up the Soviet Union with Lend-Lease. We're the reason the Soviet Union still existed. And I think naively, and it's hard to use the word naive when you talk about Franklin Roosevelt, that he believed that he could deal with Stalin, that Stalin would not be an issue after the war. And gosh, if you go to some of the, like for instance, if you go to Budapest, in the War Museum in Budapest, there's a special section dedicated to all the soldiers taken captive by the Soviets during the battle for Budapest, who never came home. They were just basically taken deep into Russia, into the gulags, where some of them returned, but most of them were never seen again. And so the Soviets weren't interested in being anybody's friend. They just wanted to get rid of all their enemies and anybody who stood in their way. And Roosevelt couldn't see that.
You do a terrific job of describing the lead up to what we call the Battle of the Bulge, which starts on December 16th, 1944. And same date as the Boston Tea Party, just a few years before. But how did Patton get that right? I know the answer because I read your book, but I would like for you to describe this amazing bit of military intelligence on behalf of Patton's staff. Again, to reference the movie, there's the meeting where Patton says, I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours or something. And everybody looks at him like, are you crazy? And the Carl Malden playing Omar Bradley goes, I'd give myself a little leeway if I were you. And Patton just replies, my staff's already worked out the plans.
Yeah.
And so to read it in your book and put the two of those things together it was mesmerizing.
Well, Patton was a huge believer in the power of intelligence. And Oscar Koch, who was his intelligence officer, his G3, he basically had spent he was at the forefront of modern military intelligence. He interrogated prisoners. He looked at maps. He knew every river. He knew every production. He looked at train schedules and saw which trains are going where from which factory to where. So he knew where the German troops were. He knew where they might be. And long before the Battle of the Bulge, he noticed I think it was back as October, that the Germans were once again massing forces near the Ardennes Forest, just like they did in May 1940. But he just couldn't find them. And so he told Patton, he said, look, Patton was supposed to do a completely different operation going due east. And instead, he was told, yeah, we can do this, but be prepared because we may have to pivot, 90 degrees north and go rescue. It turns out it was a Bastogne where he had to rescue people. And when you think of the size of an army, Third Army that's 100,000 people. And that's tanks, that's artillery pieces, that's food, that's transport. It's all that stuff. It's just not something that automatically pivots like that. And for them to pull it off and to rescue everybody in Bastogne on December 25th, it's pretty remarkable.
Is the Battle of the Bulge, you're going to hate this maybe, to me, the Gettysburg is overrated as a dispositive battle. Maybe not a dispositive event, but as a dispositive battle. I'm a believer that the Battle of Shiloh is the most important battle of the Civil War. Is the Battle of the Bulge overhyped, or could it, if the Germans had been able to be successful, what do you think how would it have altered the war?
Well, two questions there. So the first one is I don't think it's overhyped, but I think it gets that overhyped reputation because it was such a surprise. We were supposed to be, about to conquer the German nation and, go to Berlin and, Patton and Montgomery are fighting about who gets to get there first, who gets all the men and material. And when the Germans tore into the American lines with that first artillery salvo, which I think came in 4:55 in the morning or something like that, it was a bitter cold time in that part of the world. It was one of the coldest winters on record. And a lot of the troops that were stationed there were troops that were on R&R. They'd been hit pretty hard at places like the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, and they were just relaxing. They were recovering. So when the Germans came through there, nobody was ready for it. And it was one of those rare times in the history of World War II where American forces just turned and ran, and this was aimed at the American lines. It had very little to do with the British. So for Americans to turn tail like that, I think that's where we get that thing about the Battle of the Bulge being important. And let's face it, if you have something called the Battle of the Bulge, that alliteration for some reason that sticks in people's head. If you want to look at a really grisly battle, look at Hürtgen Forest, which nobody pays attention to. The second part of your question, I can't remember what you asked.
What if let's just say that the German forces had a victory that was of the same proportion as their eventual defeat? Maybe they reach Antwerp, for example, as you talk about in your book. How would it have changed the war?
Well, that's the thing. So Hitler was trying to the purpose of the Battle of the Bulge was to drive a wedge between Montgomery's forces in the north and Patton's forces in the south. And so the Germans were going to push a salient all the way, through the Ardennes Forest, all the way back across the Low Countries, into Antwerp, which would, and if they could have held that, you'd have just the German army between the American and the British armies, and then Hitler was going to sue for peace, allegedly. So if he could have pulled that off, I'm not sure his designs on peace would have had any effect. I think we were so bent on total surrender that there was no way that Hitler would have been allowed to sue for peace. But if the Germans could have taken and held that kind of ground, they would have had a complete corridor through which to shift men and material at any time during the war, which would have changed the whole shape of how we would have been fighting the war. All of a sudden the Germans would still be holding Germany, but then all of a sudden they'd be holding this corridor all the way to the ocean. And it would have been different. Would have made for a very exciting 1945.
Last thing I want to ask you before we get to the 5 questions, which I promise are harmless, we ask of all of our guests. At the end of your book, you you go into some detail about the discovery of the concentration camps, particularly Dachau. As a historian, how do you handle that topic in the sense that, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, you could tell grisly story after grisly story and include, dozens of numbing pictures. You include one, two babies killed. But how did you decide to handle that? So you handle it very matter of factly, yet it still has impact. I thought it was a terrific way to sort of include something that needs to be included without dwelling on it.
Well, I think it's best when you let the eyewitnesses, in this case, it was Gavin and Gellhorn. I was going to use Patton. Patton had a moment, with the concentration camp liberation. But when people saw those things for the first time, they were appalled. They had never seen anything like that before. And rather than try to describe it, for instance, I've been to Dachau, and it's big. It's big, and you can imagine these bunkhouses filled with people. Then you go to the section of Dachau which was reserved for torture and beatings and firing squads, and you go, and it's so much, and so rather than take my experiences where by the time I got done, I was just numb. I mean, for instance, if you take the train out of Munich into Dachau, you get off the train station. It's the same train station where all the Jews got off during the war. It's a 2-mile walk through city streets to the camp. So the people of Dachau could not say they didn't know what was going on, because they saw these people walking past them all the time with people, soldiers with dogs and guns beating them. You can't get away from that. So, but rather than put it through my filter, it's easier to put it through, like, Gavin's point of view, or Gellhorn when she went to Dachau. And I highly encourage everyone, if you get a chance to go to Europe, go to a concentration camp, but just be ready, because it's an overwhelming, it's a numbing. It's just hard. It's just one of those things that it's certainly not Disneyland.
And it's certainly not like, Gavin and Gellhorn were at Disney World, right? And all of a sudden saw this. They had seen combat and men die and all these, all the bloody hatefulness and violence of war. But yet the concentration camp knocked them back on their heels in a completely different way.
Well, you got to remember, I mean, war is war. And this was one of the last total wars. I mean, the kind of biblical style warfare where you marched through an enemy, you killed the enemy, you took their capital, you killed their king. That was World War II. It was that kind of battle. But I think within that construct, people are ready for the things that you see in war. What they were not ready for was to see the barbarism visited upon innocent civilians, especially children. That's kind of outside what I think, even at the height of the whole Nazi German thing, it was unbelievable to people that these things could have happened.
A great reaction, if you read his biography or books, is Eisenhower, who wrote back and said, "You've got to see this." When he saw the concentration camps, he wrote back to DC, his superiors, and say, "No, you have to come see this. You have to know that this happened, because if we don't, then they'll say it never happened."
Right. And he was with Patton that day. They were together on that day. So it was even, Patton, a guy who had been a warrior his whole life, was stunned, just completely stunned.
We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Martin Dugard, are you ready?
Let's go.
What was your first job?
I was in high school. I was a summer camp counselor.
What was your first concert?
Ted Nugent.
Hey, that's pretty good.
Lakeshore Amphitheater, Marquette, Michigan. Yep. That was pretty cool.
Oh, and he was in his home state, so I'm sure he was extra loud. If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you choose?
The book I give out all the time as a gift is Dispatches by Michael Herr, Herr. It is the best book I've ever read about warfare. It's about the Vietnam War.
If you could witness any event in history, be there as it happens, which event would you choose?
Be the crucifixion, without a doubt. I just having written about the crucifixion, I have so many questions about what actually took place and where it took place, and just when you go through the beating and the crown of thorns, and then it'd be horrible, but I want to see that.
I should tell you that I had a breakfast meeting this morning with a client, and she is reading Killing Jesus, and she says, I literally cannot put this book down.
Oh, good. Well, I've done my job. That's, by the way, that was a tough book to write. It's a really, that was a weird time in history, as far as people were not nice to each other.
Did Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the, did he get it right? I
have to admit that I've never seen it. I don't want to see it, and that's why. It's just I'm a man of faith. I don't need to see Christ hung on the cross.
Friends of mine walked out during the scourging. They're like, we just simply couldn't take it. And people were screaming at the screen, stop.
Oh yeah.
I've never seen it either. It just must be powerful. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, whom would you choose?
Bruce Springsteen. Who else?
Which song would he gets to sing one song? Which song would you make him sing?
Oh, Badlands, for sure.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today has been Martin Dugard, author of Taking Berlin, The Bloody Race to Defeat the Third Reich. You will notice Mr. Dugard is also the co-author with Bill O'Reilly of several of the killing books that have sold literally millions of copies. Your Taking Berlin book is terrific. I learned a lot. Very, very happy to have you on the podcast and grateful.
Oh, thanks. I had a great time. This has been a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.